All right, we look like we're live here. But thanks everybody for joining. Thanks for joining the fourth episode of Nirmata Office Hours for Kyverno. This episode, we're going to be talking about the new Kyverno Playground and also covering the Kyverno 1.10 release, migrations and upgrades and gotchas and things like that with a live demo of that upgrade process. So if there are no housekeeping topics that we want to cover before then, let's just go ahead and get started with the playground show. Charlie, I'll turn it over to you to talk about and show us that playground.
Sure. Okay, so let me share my screen. I guess you see my screen. Just give me 1 second. So, we recently added a new tool to the Kyverno ecosystem. And this tool started like a side project between Frank, one of the Kyverno maintainers, and I. We had the idea when we came back from KubeCon in Amsterdam, and the idea was to create a website where you could experiment with Kyverno without installing a cluster or even installing a CLI. The idea of the tool is to allow creating policies and resources and evaluating the resources against the policies you create and have a visual result in your browser and understand how Kyverno works, why a resource is accepted or rejected for certain policy, discover the different types of policies Kyverno supports, eventually share the policies you wrote with others. So the tool looks like this. It's pretty simple. You have policies on the left and resources on the right. This is a very simple policy. One policy that require a label on pod. So you have the match clause with the pod kinds and the validation rule that requires that an app.kubernetes.io/name label is present on the resource. On the right, you have a pod. This pod is a simple Nginx pod, and it doesn't have the expected label. So based on this, if you start the evaluation, the results will be a failure, and you can have the explanation why the resource was rejected based on the policy. So it tells you the resource, it tells you the policy that generated this response, and it tells you the status and the message. So if you want to get this policy to pass, of course, you can just add the expected label and try it again. And this time it passes, and that's it. So I think that's what we had in the first version, just this. Policies on one side, resources on one side. There is more than just policies and resources, but those are the main elements when playing with Kyverno. You can go in the advanced tab and you will have more options. We support almost every configuration element existing in Kyverno. So we have the context. The context is used to specify which Kubernetes version is targeted. So we could have put 1.25 here. We also have the information related to the user that will be used when simulating an admission review, because we have a policy, we have a resource, but as we are completely simulating the admission review process, we don't have any user. This user doesn't belong to any groups. It doesn't have roles. It doesn't have cluster roles. We don't really have namespaces, so we cannot infer the namespace labels and things like this. So in certain situations like this, I can say I can test with an edit Charlie user, save it, and I can here say that I want to exclude all, and I think it's, so one good thing is that you have autocomplete. So it helps a lot. So it's probably not kind. I don't really remember how to write those rules. I would have expected kind user. It's probably not going to work. Okay, so yeah, it seems that it worked in fact, and I've put another one. Okay, so in the advanced tab, I can simulate specific information about the admission context regarding the user and things we can't infer that would be present in a real admission review, but it's not present in the playground. So we offer the option to set them up to simulate that. And we have also the possibility to configure Kyverno flags, like enabling exceptions, restricting exceptions to a single namespace, flags related to cosine, and more flags are coming in the next versions. We also have the possibility to set the values of variables when those variables can't be evaluated directly in the rule. So we could say test something, and those variables will be available in the rules when you configure the rules. We support Kyverno configuration, so you can bring your own Kyverno configuration here. We support custom resource definitions, so we can have rules for cert manager, for example, or other things. We support policy exceptions, so you can simulate how policy exceptions behave in Kyverno. And if you combine this with the policy exceptions related flags, you can create exceptions, but disable policy exceptions, and you will see that the exceptions are not considered when Kyverno evaluates the resource against the policy. And we can also, and you can also simulate a cluster with different resources in it. It's particularly useful when you play with generate rules or mutate existing rules, because those rules usually need some resource loaded from the cluster. So you can simulate the presence of the resource using this cluster resources editor. Okay, and because today the playground supports almost everything Kyverno does, but it's not always easy to, it makes things very configurable, but it requires some knowledge about Kyverno to use correctly. So for that, we created a bunch of tutorials and examples. So these examples are pre-configured configuration. And if we take custom resources, for example, we can you can just pick one of the examples or one of the tutorials. It will bring policies and resources. Those policies and resources are already available, and you can start playing with them and understand what works and what doesn't work. So, for example, in this case, we have one policy for certificates coming from Cert Manager, and we have two certificates. One will pass and the other will not. So in this case, this one doesn't pass because only one DNS name entry is allowed per certificate request. And we can see that we have two DNS names in this certificate. So that's what the rule here is doing. So, so basically, it's a very useful tool for people who want to discover Kyverno without setting up anything. And it's also extremely useful for people that already know about Kyverno, but want to improve and discover new features or try things outside of a real cluster. I know a couple of users have used it to troubleshoot their policies that didn't behave as they expected, and then they use the playground to test the policies against resources and make adjustments until the policy was correct. And final point is the share button. The share button today is useful when you want to get some help from the community. You can just create, click the share button, and you get a new URL in your clipboard. Then you can use this URL to paste the link on Slack or somewhere else. And other users will have access to the playground the same with the same configuration as you, and then they can experiment, troubleshoot, and help with this. So it's a great tool to share and discuss issues or policies in the community.
Yeah, the playground is pretty cool. There's a lot more than this too, but you could probably spend a whole hour just talking about the playground.
Yeah, probably. Well, other options are, of course, to save your changes locally. So you can, I don't know, let's say I want to fix this. Okay, the playground told me that I must have only one DNS name, so I removed the second one. Now they all passed. And finally, I want to save locally the fixes. Then I go somewhere doing something else. I say, okay, let's try with another policy. And in the end, you can load again the fixed the fixed backup. Yeah, the fixed yeah, you can load again what you saved earlier. So it's always available. You can export and import the profiles. So this is just a YAML file in the end, but if you export it, you can easily, I don't know, store it in a Git repository, share it with your colleagues or things like this. And that's a good way to share the different profiles and help others understand how you created a policy, or getting some help troubleshooting what doesn't work. It's also helpful because you have the autocomplete feature. So, well, background is already present, but I don't know, you want to apply rules. It helps writing the policies. It's not always easy to write a policy from scratch. So having a tool that will validate as you type the policy, or help specifying the required fields is great, because, well, not easy to remember about everything. We recently added support for all the policy versions, and all policy types and all policy versions. So it knows about, the playground knows about policies in V1 and V2 beta 1. And when I say it knows about policies, it knows about namespace policies, but also cluster policies. So the JSON schema we use to make the validation is aware of the API version and kind you selected to create the policy. So it's pretty complete. We don't have the same, unfortunately, in the resources editor. We could do it, but it has not happened yet.
Can you talk a little bit about the this running in a local cluster and what options are available to folks if they pass the cluster flag?
Sure. So I will share another screen then, because let's say is this one? Yeah, this one. So another. Okay, are you seeing my VS Code?
Yep.
Okay. Let me share everything. It will be easier, because I probably will have to switch. So another use case was to connect the playground directly to a cluster. Of course, this is not possible with the public instance of the playground. The public instance of the playground is not connected to any cluster, and it's not going to change because users probably don't want to send their kubeconfig to a public website. The kubeconfig should be kept private, and in a lot of setups anyway, the API server won't be joinable publicly. So for this, we allowed running the playground locally. We publish releases with instructions to install the playground on the GitHub repository. When doing this, you just run the backend locally on your computer, and you can enable the connection to a cluster. So right now, the backend is running on my computer, and I can connect to the playground using the localhost 8080 port. And I have another icon here, which is the cluster icon. And I can simply pick up resources from the live cluster. So this is a pod running in my cluster. I can do the same with with policies. So clicking on this button, I can choose the kind of policy I want to load. Then I can search it. And I can click this one. For example, I just have one policy, so I will load this one. I could have loaded a lot more pods because I have more. And okay, probably not working well right now. And I can then use this to fetch the resources I want to use in the playground. And of course, when you run this connected to a cluster, if the policy needs to load some resources from the cluster, you don't have to add them in the cluster resources, or you don't have to add your policy exceptions in the policy exception editor. It will directly load them from the connected cluster. So this only works when you run the playground locally. It's just a simple CLI. You just say Kyverno Playground and you hit enter, or you add -- cluster to tell that you want to connect to the cluster. And you can browse the same playground as the public instance on your local machine. And then in this case, you have the connection with the cluster.
Yeah, that's super handy. The ability to go and fetch both policies and resources live from a cluster and then play with them in the playground, and it won't push them back to the cluster. So you can use them and make changes to them and simulate what's going to happen if it's kind of like the Kyverno CLI in that there's a cluster flag, but this goes a step further in that you can fetch policies from it as well and play with them live. So really cool feature.
Yeah, it won't. Yeah, it's a good point. It won't change anything in your cluster. It uses your kubeconfig to talk with the cluster, so the permissions are the same as your local user. It doesn't necessarily reflect what the Kyverno admission controller permissions will have when running inside a real cluster. So it all runs with your own credentials and permissions. And another thing we would like to add when working in cluster connected mode is finally, we could allow users to just paste resources, and the playground could just apply the policies that exist in the cluster. So when you're in cluster connected mode, you don't necessarily want to play with policies, but you potentially just want to take a resource and ask, will this resource be accepted or rejected based on the current cluster configuration? And for that, we could just load the policies from the cluster. Every policy we find in the cluster, you put your resource in the resource editor and you hit the start button. And we say true or false. Will your resource be accepted or not? The advantage is that when connected to a cluster, we can use the real Kyverno config map. We can probably have information about the flags that were passed to the Kyverno admission controller. So all these advanced options could be directly inferred from the underlying cluster, and the policies could also be inferred from the underlying cluster. So it's an interesting use case where a developer, for example, doesn't really want to test his resource and provide the policies. He just knows about the resource he wants to create. So he can run the playground locally connected to the cluster. He provides the resource, and the playground will tell him if the resource is valid or not based on the policies that exist on the cluster.
You want to talk about the types of Kyverno policies that are supported in the playground? Just real quick.
Oh, we are every policy, every kind of policy and cluster policy is supported in the playground. So we have V1, V2 beta 1 policy and cluster policy. Actually, the playground is based on the main version of Kyverno. So there are a couple of things that have not been released yet. I don't know if I probably didn't keep it, but for example, it's already possible to test the upcoming validation admission policy feature that will be part of the 1.11 Kyverno release. You cannot use validating admission policy yet in 1.10, but the playground has early support for it.
And just to, I guess what I was getting at was the rule type. So validate, mutate is supported. It'll show you the results of mutation. It'll show you the results of generation. And you can also test your verify images rules if, when you're using the public playground, if the image is from a public image registry, the playground can go and fetch that and verify things like signatures and attestations on it, right, Charles?
Yeah, definitely. As
Well,
long as this is coming from a public registry, it will work. So in this case, for example, we are verifying signature from the ghcr.io Kyverno test verify image. And we have a pod here with this image, and this one is signed. So if I run this, of course, it works. If I run, I think we have an unsigned image. And in this case, well, it doesn't work. So unverified image. So he actually found a digest for the tag, but this digest is not signed. So as long as this is public, a public registry, you can completely use it in the playground. And I think we support almost everything except mutate existing rules. We plan to support mutate existing rules in the next release. And coming with the next release, we will policy rules, all policy Kyverno rules, and all Kyverno configuration elements. So the playground will have the full support for every configuration and every policy. Sometimes we will have to mock the data and things like this, because in the public instance, we just can't access the cluster or private registries. And when running the playground locally, you will be able to use private registries for image verification and things like this. You should have no limitation when you run the playground locally on your computer. It won't be the case on the public instance, but everything should be supported if you run it on your local machine and have access to a cluster.
Awesome. Thanks so much for showing us that.
Yeah, because usually talking with private registries require tokens that are stored in secrets in the cluster. So if you have a secret in the cluster and you have access to the cluster, we can completely simulate this on your local machine in the playground. This just is not possible in a public instance. So probably the next step is to make it as easy as possible to install the playground locally. We are thinking about publishing on Brew So Mac OS users just have to brew install the Kyverno Playground. It didn't happen yet. So right now you have to download the binary from the GitHub release page. Or it's still not that difficult, but we would like the experience to be a bit better. Okay, you're welcome. I think that's it. Well, don't hesitate if you find bugs or if you like it. Please share in the Slack channel.
Yep, indeed. All right, great. Thanks a lot. Let's get to the next topic here, which is upgrades to Kyverno 110. So we've got about 30 minutes left here. What we want to talk about in this portion of the office hours is some of the changes in 110 and also how to actually do an upgrade. And I'll do an upgrade live from the previous version 1.9. So the first thing that you need to keep in mind is Kyverno 110 has a ton of features and changes in it. In fact, there are almost 500 PRs that have been merged that constitute the 1.10 release. And one of the hallmark features of this release is that, and I'm showing the release notes here for the 110 release. So feel free to read along if you're out there watching. If you're watching this recorded, please go and read the release notes carefully. One of the first things you'll see here is that we've split the main Kyverno deployment into 3 separate controllers, each one running in their own deployment. And so as a result of this, a lot of things had to change. We just simply couldn't do things the same way when we're taking one thing and we're breaking it out into 3 by functionality. So as a result of that, and of course, other things, the Helm chart had to change, a lot of the values had to change, other internals had to change. So I won't go and read all of these release notes, but the point I'm trying to make is that Kyverno 110 has a lot of new features, a lot of structural changes, and a result of that, there are some breaking changes that are here. And just want to call out a few of these because these will be relevant in the upgrade process. Is a lot of the work that went into the generate rule type. We fixed a lot of issues. We improved a lot of things. Shooting here was instrumental in getting all of that done. Tremendous amount of work. And we really just wanted to provide a better experience and obviously fix things that hadn't worked for a while. So some of the breaking changes are going to be in the generate area. And one of those I'm going to demonstrate in this upgrade process. Another thing to point out are permissions. So because the Kyverno controllers were all broken out, if you're using aggregated permissions, those are going to have to be slightly updated. And a couple other things when it comes to Kyverno policies that we're doing proper validation now. So some fields will be, they were technically required in the past, but Kyverno 110 will enforce these for you. And there are a bunch of other added features, not going to have time to get into all of these, but gist of this is 110 is a very big release, has a lot of structural new features, and in addition to fixes and enhancements. Please read the release notes carefully. There are some breaking changes in this. And with that, we'll flip over and talk about the migration from version 2 to version 3 of the Helm chart, where we'll show some of these. So there's a whole migration guide. It's linked to in this big bold type at the very end of the release notes. Kyverno supports 2 installation artifacts today. The official one, the recommended one that we go with is the Helm chart. And the Helm chart has all of the knobs and buttons that one would need to press and turn in order to deploy Kyverno in just about any environment type today. There's a tremendous amount of flexibility there. The other one is a plain YAML install manifest that's part of each release. That's also supported, but it has no buttons and knobs and things to turn. So it's really typically only suited for small environments and test dev type situations. So we're talking about the Helm chart migration here. If you're using the YAML manifest, if you use that to install previous versions, there is no upgrade path. This does not apply to you if you were using the YAML manifest. You will have to remove and then reinstall. So obviously you want to make sure that you do this in a maintenance window. And also some of these steps actually do apply. Particularly, you want to be able to back up your policies, assuming that you don't have those in some sort of version control. So this process really only applies to Helm because that's, like I mentioned, our official and recommended route. So there are two options you have when upgrading to 110. One of them is an actual uninstallation and reinstallation, and that's what I'm going to cover here. The other one is the scale to 0, which I'm not going to cover, but all of these steps are provided for you. So in the first option, the reason why we recommend this one is because, number one, it gets rid of any older cruft that might have been accumulating, particularly as you're upgrading from version to version. Depending on the chart, some things that are typically minor in nature could be left behind. This is just the safest way to ensure that all that stuff gets removed. And also, the main thing is it allows rechecking your policies against Kyverno 110. So when we create a policy in the cluster, we're doing validation of the custom resource, but we're also doing further checks that Kyverno is doing as part of its webhook to ensure that your experience that you're getting at the end of the day is proper. And one of those things is that, and I'll show this as part of this upgrade process, if you're doing things like mutate existing, we need to make sure that you have the permissions to do that so that you don't have unexpected failures. If you're trying to generate a resource, those that are using the generate rule type, you need to have permissions to be able to generate that thing if it's a non-standard resource. So we're going to do things like checking the policies to make sure that they're schematically valid, checking to make sure that you have permissions, other things like that. These are all guardrail checks. So for that reason, we want to make sure that you're in the best position possible when you upgrade. And so that's why that we recommend this uninstallation process. Now, a couple things to point out about it. Because we are removing Kyverno, even though we're going to back up policies, and you'll show me go through that, and then we'll restore them. This is typically a minor concern, but we want to call it out. Policy reports Kyverno generates and manages for you automatically. However, if you have policy reports from policies or rules and policies where background scanning is not enabled, and some policies cannot have background scans enabled because you're doing things like matching on a username or a group name or a cluster role. All of those things aren't accessible once a resource already exists in a cluster, and so background scans won't work for those. If you have those, you may want to opt for the second option so that it preserves those reports. May not be an issue for some, may be an issue for others. Just want to call it out because you should be mindful that that's going to occur. All right, so what we're going to follow the procedure that's here. I'm going to start with a 1.9 cluster. I have already read the complete release notes first. So once again, and this is just good practice, regardless of what software you're using, what version you're upgrading to. Please take the time to read all the release notes carefully. There may be some things in there that are particularly impactful to you that may not be impactful to others. Please take the time to read the release notes first. I can't stress that enough, especially with this release. Read all the release notes. Good idea to read them twice. All right, so we're going to start this, and first thing we're going to do here is we're going to back up all of the Kyverno policy resources to a backup manifest. But actually, if you'll note this other statement down here, if you are using generate rules, and we are using one in this case, we'll need to make a modification to that. And that is, if you're using generate rules with a data type, then if you're using synchronization, we need to make sure that we disable synchronization so that when we pull the policies away, your generated resources don't disappear. Also to note, we are working furiously on the first patch for this version, which we expect next week. This should address an issue that we found with clone type rules. So just for a very quick overview, for those who may not know, generate rules come in primarily two flavors. You have a data type in which the resource that you want to generate is defined in the Kyverno rule itself. That's the data type. Or we have the clone type where the source resource is a pre-existing resource that's in your cluster. You can follow this right now if you have data type generate rules, but please wait for the first patch before doing this with the clone type rules. And I won't go into details. It's out there. You can go and check the issue, but we do have a generate rule of a data type, and in this case, we've got some resource quotas. And so let's just go and get those out there. So you'll notice that synchronization is enabled. I've got a couple of resource quotas that have already been generated. So before I go and back all these policies up, what I need to do is change synchronize to false here, because I don't want these to go away. So I'm going to go and reapply this in the cluster. And so that's been configured. So there's I've done the prep work on my generate rule. Just to show what else I have out here, I've got a verify images rule that's in audit, and this will become important later. This is already out there. I've also got, and I pulled this, all of these are straight from the policy library, by the way. So if any of these sound interesting and you've never seen them before, they're already out there. You can just go download them. This is a mutate existing rule that we have installed that's going to go and mutate a deployment if a certain secret changes. So we also have this one out there, and this will also become important when I illustrate one common thing that may throw you for a loop. So all these already exist. Now I've done the preparatory work. Let me just go back and make sure. So I'm using a data type. I've set synchronization to false. All right, now I'm going to go and copy and paste this command. This is going to grab all of the Kyverno resources, and it's going to dump them into a file called Kyverno backup.yaml. And we can go and take a look at that. It's all of our policies that I just called out here. And we can go and make sure that the generate rule is set with synchronization to false. Synchronization is false, so that's good. All right, so now we have that. Now we can uninstall Kyverno. So I've installed this with the Helm chart. All right, so I will now uninstall this. And by the way, I'm running this on a K3D cluster, so there are a couple other charts that are installed. And it should go and yank this chart away. Okay. So I'm getting an error, of course, because the CRDs are gone, and so all my policies are gone. So now we have that. Very important to review the new chart value. So I won't go through this because a lot of things have changed in the chart. If you have a saved command, or if you're using Argo CD or whatever your method is for deploying the Kyverno Helm chart, you will need to go and update that. As I mentioned, as a result of this decomposition, the structure of the chart has changed significantly because we're going from version 2 of the chart to version 3 of the chart. There's no direct translation of those fields, so you'll need to go and do that. I could talk a lot about that. Won't go into all of that. I'm just going to copy and paste a command that I have saved for Helm chart installation, and that is this. Let's see, where am I? All right, so I'm going to install, this is going to be the new version. So one of the things, just to quickly call out, the flags have now changed to a map. So if you're using flags that were in a list, those have now changed to a map to allow better configuration, ease of configuration. So I don't need to create the namespace. We'll leave these flags here. So policy exceptions are enabled, dump payload, and I've got logging turned up higher. All right, so now I'm going to hit go on this. This will install version 1.10 of Kyverno. So give this just a second and flip back over here. So we are installing version 3 of the chart. I'll touch a little bit on the scale to 0 method after this is complete, because there's a couple things to know. Again, all of this is, as you can see, I'm reading from the document. It's all spelled out there. I'll get to that after this. And before we restore the Kyverno policies, which is the next step, we need to make one minor change. So now we have Kyverno 1.10 installed. And if we take a look at the pods here, now I'm only running a single replica of each, but you'll notice that, and I guess I didn't show it with the previous version, but we now have 4 deployments, each one running a single pod. As a result of that decomposition, as I mentioned, 1 deployment basically became 3. So we've got one for reports controller, background controller, which handles your generate and your mutate existing rules, and your admission controller. We already had the cleanup controller as a separate deployment in version 1.9. So anyhow, you're going to see, this is what you're going to see when you deploy the new version. So just make sure that everything's up and running. Okay, so good, everything's there. Now let's go to our backup file and let's flip over here. So call out before restoring the policies, because we have a generate. Now this doesn't necessarily apply to you if you don't have a generate with a data type, but I do. So we need to make 2 changes here. We disabled synchronization before we exported things. Now we need to put that back, but we also need to enable this field called generate existing. Now, prior versions, we had a field called generate existing on policy update. That one will still be accepted, but it's deprecated and we're trying to move to this new flag name, our field name. So please set spec generate existing to true. So let's go make these 2 changes. My editor. So we're going to go and change here, synchronize to true. And we're going to set generate existing to true. So this is just in my generate rule that's here. All right, so now that I have that set, I've done all of this. All right. Now I'm going to see a failure here, and that's what I expect because I want to call out a couple other things, but I'm going to go ahead and create this policy. Now this is in the 1.10 version. So we're going to create from the, we're going to restore from the backup that we just took. All right, so a couple errors that we got here, and these are important to point out because these are commonly employed policies. We try to do a thorough job of telling you exactly why policies that might have been backed up aren't accepted. So let's take a look at the first one here. We got 2 errors. Denied the request, verify images mutate digest. Mutate digest must be set to false for audit. So what this is saying is we have a verify images rule that's set to audit. And in verify images, the reason, the idea of it being an audit is we don't want to make any changes to your pods when they come in. In prior versions, we weren't making a strict enforcement of this, but we need to do that in 1.10 so that we're not touching them when they're in audit mode. So I'll go and find my verify images policy, and I will make sure that mutate digest is set to false. And I'm also going to change required to false as well. But since we have autogen, we'll need to change that where we have autogen as well. So I'll make those changes here. I'll make them here as well. So this will allow us to get past this one because we don't want Kyverno to modify things when it's in audit mode. So we'll make those changes there. So that should take care of the first one. The second one here is off check failed. Update the cluster role. We've actually changed this message. Kyverno is telling you, hey, I cannot update deployments based on your policy that's installed. And the reason why this may happen is as a result of this decomposition, the cluster role aggregations have changed because the labels have slightly changed. So what you'll need to do is get your aggregated permission role, and I'm showing this here, and change it to something like this. So you'll notice that we're using these 3 labels that are just for the background controller. You'll notice that I'm not updating a cluster role, I'm going to create a new one. So if you don't have a cluster role, you might be updating one yourself, which is fine. You might be creating a new one. Whatever the case is, you need to be able to do a command like this to see that Kyverno can perform the necessary modifications. So in my policy, I'm updating deployments. That's going to be done by the background controller. Here's a simple command that you can use to check and see if Kyverno is going to have the permissions to do that. It doesn't matter how you grant the privileges. If you cannot get a yes back from this command, Kyverno is not going to be able to do it either. So as expected, it says no. we will create this cluster role, which will aggregate to the right role for our background controller. And we will repeat the command. We should get a yes. We can now get a yes. That means Kyverno should be able to get a yes. So let's go back and try and create this backup that we exported and then modified. Oh, I guess it already created. Okay, so it already added it previously added the generate rule. So that was already there. So let's go and get our cluster policies. So we see that all of our cluster policies are there. That's good. And so we're set from those two. Let's just make sure from the generation rule, we were generating a resource quota. Let's get our quotas. And we've got our resource quotas that are here. And let's just make sure, since synchronization is enabled, I'm going to flip this back. Well, no, I'll change it into the backup file. Let's just make sure that we can actually modify this and have things update downstream. So I'm going to change the limits.cpu field from 5 to 6. So you see my existing generated resources all have 5. I want synchronization to be enabled. I now want to make an update. So I want to continue to manage the life cycle of this. And let's reapply it. Okay, I must have. Okay, I guess I already did that. All right, well, I'll go and modify the one that's here and set this one back to true. And this one should already be set to true. And I'll change limits to 6. So well, let me just edit it. So I go and change this to 6. Okay, so it looks good. And as you can see, everything now updated downstream so that we're able to continue to manage our life cycle of our generated resources. Had a little hiccup because the resource version was incremented and I didn't put that into the policy. So anyhow, that is the full process of doing option 1 for the Kyverno 1.10 upgrade. So let me flip back over and just briefly touch, because we got only a couple minutes. Scale to 0, very similar in a lot of regards. In this one, you're going to scale the deployments down to 0, and then you're going to actually remove the cleanup one. You will notice that you will have to pass this flag if you want to upgrade from version 2 to version 3 of the chart. This is an upgrade method. Again, obviously manual steps are required, but if you do have those policy reports that come from admission mode, policies that are in admission mode and don't have background mode enabled, then this may be something that you want to do. Again, we recommend that you go with the first option. The primary reason for not going with this one is if you're doing an in-place upgrade, Kyverno is not going to have the ability to check all of those policies that you saw me try and reinstall earlier. So the messages that I showed that were being shown to me by Kyverno, wherever they were. Well, I must have scrolled them off. The messages that I saw as far as what I needed to update on my system and the policies, you won't see that. So you may have to make other modifications based on status changes and whatnot. So try and go with option 1 if you can. If you absolutely must go with option 2, again, with either option, please read the release notes very carefully. go and make those modifications. If you're using generate rules of the clone type, please wait for the first patch. Expect that soon, where we should have all of this working and everything should be copacetic with the ability to generate and synchronize those resources. And I think that's it as far as that goes. I know we have 1 minute left. Any questions or anything else that anybody wants to chime in with? All right, well, thanks everybody for attending this episode of Nirmata Office Hours for Kyverno. Check back with us next month. Not sure what the topic will be, but it'll be something good. So thanks everybody. See you next time.